Hello everyone, welcome to Fixing the Future Education Edition, the online event dedicated to explore the future of education together with 7 of the world's most inspiring experts. Benvolguts al Fixing the Future Education Edition, l'esdeveniment en línia que comença avui i que es dedicarà a explorar el futur de l'educació de la mà de 7 dels experts més inspiradors del món. This event is organized by Atlas of the Future, a multi-platform project dedicated to promote the optimism in the future by sharing every day the stories of the projects and people who are solving the world's challenges. This event will develop through 7 sessions every Thursday from 6 to 7 p.m. And you will have not only the unique opportunity to listen to our experts, but also to interact with them by asking questions using the chat box. So please do not miss this opportunity and ask as many questions as you wish. I also remind you that there will be 2 channels, one in English, in the original language of the event, and the other one simultaneously translated in Catalan. Therefore, check now in which channel you are, because if you're not in the right one, you should swap it. But if we are all ready, we're going to start now our first session, and we have the honor to have with us Stefania Giannini, Assistant Director General for Education for UNESCO. Her session will be moderated by Eduard Vallory, founder and director of Escola Nova 21, president of UNESCO CAT, as well as a very good friend of the Atlas. So, welcome, Eduard.
Professor Giannini was appointed Assistant Director General for Education of UNESCO in 2018, and she became the top United Nations official in the field of education. She holds a PhD in linguistics, and in 1992 she became Professor of Linguistics at the University for Foreigners of Perugia. In 2004 she became the Rector of the university, position she had for 8 years, and she became the youngest female Rector in Italy. Later on, she was elected Senator of the Republic of Italy in 2013 for 5 years, and she was the Minister of Education, Universities and Research of Italy between 2014 and 2016, when she developed and implemented a structural reform of the Italian education system focused on social inclusion and cultural awareness. During her time at UNESCO, Professor Giannini has become a reference for educational policies. Her strategic vision and leadership contributes to avoid that the SDG 4, the one of education, becomes just a text, pushing for clear policies to make its achievement possible. I remember last year at the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in New York, where she raises awareness on the extent of the global learning crisis. She said, we need a paradigm shift in how we teach and how we learn, and this calls for transformation, innovation, and support to teachers. And she added that education for sustainable development and for global citizenship are part of this ambitious project to foster in children a sense of critical thinking, respect, and human dignity. In the COVID-19 age, she has been working even more for strong education policies to promote inclusion, to guarantee human rights, and to protect children from harm, particularly girls from gender inequality and sexual violence. Likewise, her message for the future, starting now, is clear. We must build stronger education systems for the post-COVID time and to answer the global challenges. The work of Professor Giannini is inspiring for many of us, and I am sure that her talk today will be so as well. Probably both her deep belief in the power of education and the smile she always wears are somehow connected to that quote from Le Petit Prince. It is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Grazie ancora, Professoressa Stefania Giannini, and the floor is yours.
Grazie veramente, Eduard. Thank you very much for your kind words, and thank you very much for this invitation and dedicating also the first talk in this important initiative, Fixing Education, organized by Atlas of the Future, to the topic we are discussing today, the future of education. Well, you mentioned an important time we were together last year in New York at Anger Week. And I just start, if I may, from that point. September 2019, UNESCO launched a very inspiring initiative. We called it the Futures of Education, Futures with S of plural. And this was, still is, intended to rethink learning and knowledge in a world of uncertainty, complexity, and fragility. And this was very much about this paradigm shift I mentioned. Our intention is still to draw up from across society views from scientists to philosophers, from artists to teachers, from young people to political circles, in order to set an agenda for educational transformation. And this project builds on a tradition that UNESCO has. I can mention the very well-known the Law Report, launched in the middle of the 90s, and also the previous one in the 70s, the Fourier Report. But today we are talking, we are moving, we are living in a completely different world. I think last year was almost last century, if you look at it from the perspective of today. This COVID-19 crisis already became a game changer, we can say. It's about a disruption in our daily life. It's about putting education through a kind of time of single and how can I say very unprecedented type of particle accelerator, so to say. The shock to systems caused by school and university closure in more than 119 countries has no parallel since the creation of the United Nations, has no parallel in history. As countries face second and third waves of the pandemic in these weeks, all education systems are grappling with multiple pressures. This week, when we are talking about the future of education, schools are still closed in about 31 countries, affecting over 500 million learners. And in many others, they are functioning along hybrid models, in-person and remote. Everywhere, teachers and education personnel are called upon to guarantee safety and hygiene, assessing learning losses, as well as social-emotional impact of the pandemic. And students are justifiably worried about their future, their exams, their unprecedented challenges in learning, and also their job projects after and prospects after their study at university or in the high school. So my premise today is that while the ongoing pandemic increases by the day the risk of exclusion and learning loss, and let me say UNESCO started from the very beginning to ring the alarm about this topic, the crisis is also generating transformation that will be a long-needed turning point in the purpose and practice of education and its perception and place in society. In many ways, the crisis has somehow leveled recurrent debates of the past years, the relationship between teachers and technology, the conservatism of education as a sector, on the self-interest of the head tech players. Everywhere, governments and partners have reacted swiftly to deploy distance learning solutions and reacted, I can say, promptly to give solutions and concrete reaction to the crisis. Above all, we have witnessed the overarching value that education carries for individuals and society. children climbing up trees and capture an internet signal to access their courses, teachers checking up individually on students. We saw so many kind of new laboratories, spontaneous laboratories for innovation. But let me say that we must be very honest, no systems were really prepared for such a shock. UN agencies came together rapidly to support countries with policy guidance, emergency resources, technical backing. But the most important key word we experience in this crisis in education, within the UN system and outside, is about a new kind of solidarity and partnership. UNESCO provided, from the beginning of the crisis, a platform for education ministers and all actors involved in the provision of learning, to learn from each other, to share experiences, to share also a kind of concern about the future next steps to be done. On how to set up distance learning platforms to digitize contents, to train teachers to be well trained to do that new kind of job or new kind of role in the classroom, and to manage high stakes exams and above all, reach the most vulnerable segment of student population. In March, we launched what we called a global education coalition to support governments in such an unprecedented environment. The coalition today counts more than 150 partners working across 70 countries. And the massive efforts made in a short time to respond to the shocks to education systems remind us that changes previously considered difficult or at all impossible to implement are now possible, and change is becoming a bit the new normal. And this is a positive side of the coin. We are at a crossroads now. The time has come to switch out of the emergency mode. It's time, to encompass the most ambitious goal ever adopted by the international community, SDG number 4, to achieve inclusive, equitable, and quality education for all, and to promote a lifelong learning opportunities for all by 2030. This leaves one decade, 10 years more or less than 10 years, we can say, at the end of 2020, which the UN has urged be one of action. This will require still transformational change, disruption, innovation, commitment. And these keywords are part of the agenda we have to implement together from now to the next coming months and years. Well, let me set the scene about the impact of the pandemic in education. It exacerbates and amplifies the crisis that we're already battling. Numbers for sure, 200, almost 60 million children and youth out of school before the crisis, 50% of students not acquiring basic literacy and numeracy after several years in school. It is about proficiency, and over 750 million adults who are not literate yet. Let's take a look at the most salient facts and figures, and as a quick reminder about the crisis, at the peak of the pandemic, 1.6 billion students were affected in over 190 countries. At a time when the world has been growing more unequal, we have witnessed the devastating impact of inequalities on learning. And this applies universally in the global north and global south. It's estimated that for the first since its conception, the Human Development Index, of which the education dimension accounts for a third, will show a striking decline. Approximately one-third of students, close to 450 million, had no access to remote learning during the pandemic. On an average, half of teachers lacked the basic digital skills to manage online learning. And since the onset of the pandemic, students have lost on average 50 days of schooling, which is a lot. Today we know that nearly our numbers and projections, the nearly 24 million children and youth from preschooling to university level are today at risk of dropout this year, 2020, due to the crisis. So this is a future of fragility, uncertainty still, and a lot of challenges in front of us. But it's still a future of opportunities. The job outlook is grim with you at the highest risk. More, more than ever, there is evidence that in the economic downturn, domestic education budgets will shrink for sure, less money around, and new priorities in political agendas of the world. And education will face stiff competition from other sectors. Fiscal space will be reduced, and data education will decline. According to our preliminary research about that, education and training is receiving an early invisible share of stimulus packages set up by countries to support recovery from COVID-19 crisis, less than 1%. There are high-stake choices to make today to respect and expand the right to education as a bulwark against inequalities and the bedrock of a more just and sustainable future. This starts with immediate actions that are rooted in a longer-term societal vision. If not yet post-COVID, at least drawing lessons from this global experience that has affected every community, every single individual in the world, exposing the extent of our interdependence with each other, a nature, and the value of common public goods, namely the right to health and the right to education. Exactly 1 week ago, UNESCO convened a special event, a special global education meeting. It brought together 15 heads of state, heads of government, and more than 80 ministers of education and development around a virtual room convened by UNESCO. Together, they agreed on some priority actions for the recovery, focusing on reopening schools safety, supporting all teachers as frontline runners in the process, investing in skills development, and narrowing the digital divide, which is still a huge obstacle for quality education for all, especially now. They also emphasize the importance to protect education finance, domestic and international aid. Keeping in mind the lens of this series, Fixing the Future, as you say, let me provide a few essentials on how to make our education systems fit for our times, building on this political commitment we received from leaders of the world some days ago. These are times when there is no escape from interdependence. This pandemic affects every nation. Times when climate change is threatening our future, for sure. It's still a big elephant in the room, of course. We talk a bit less about climate change because of the pandemic, but we know that the linkages between these two topics are very much clear. It's time where the digital revolution is accelerating globalization, disrupting jobs, and radically transforming every aspect of our daily life, from our political institutions to the kind of agenda that we are building together. There are strong forces of fragmentation dividing our society. 2 weeks ago, education was struck at the core with the barbaric murder of the French history and geography teacher Samuel Paty. I'm sure you know and you heard about that. For teaching a class on how to understand the freedom of expression. All this is deeply challenging for education systems and all of us as a community. They are not isolated from a wider world, but directly affected by it and carrying the responsibility to apprehend how to shape a better future. We have to jumpstart, to renew education, recognizing is as a main pillar, as a main infrastructure of more resilient, sustainable, and fair societies, with attention to some key topics and objectives: inclusion, teachers, and technology. To combat inequalities, inclusion must become the gold standard of every education system. It's not the case yet, we know. Inclusion is a culture that recognizes diversity, cultural diversity as well, and works with it as a fabric for making our society more cohesive and just. It's the yardstick of recovery. It starts with creating the condition and environments where all children are treated with dignity and learn, regardless of identity, background, or ability. This is a very tough call, requiring measures to target those most in need, teaching to fulfill every learner's potential and leadership to combat discrimination and create a sense of belonging and make diversity a force. The mental health and well-being of children has been endangered in ways that could have lasting repercussions, and we cannot calculate yet the size of these consequences. It's urgent to mainstream socio-emotional skills in education systems, not only for inner well-being, let me say, but because these skills ignite neural pathways to learning and caring. A resilient educational recovery is one co-created with teachers. Teachers somehow are our heroes in the virtual classroom as well in the traditional ones, a bit like medical doctors in hospital, we can say. The education systems best prepared to respond to crisis will be those capable of valuing their teachers, valorize their role, their position in society, granting them more autonomy and giving them the conditions to work collaboratively. In the declaration endorsed at our Global Education meeting last week, I mentioned before, participants committed to support all teachers and education personnel as frontline workers, and drew attention to the urgency of addressing their training and professional development needs, especially digital skills. I think it's an important achievement. It's a starting point, but it's an important achievement. They also committed to narrowing the digital divide in education, as I said before. Technology is no longer an add-on, but a must-have. It's no more a luxury. It's something which is very much embedded in and within the right to education. A new concept of right to education we have to reshape. It's built into system to improve learning, pedagogies, training, and resilience to crisis. There is still insufficient evidence on the effectiveness of distance learning solutions, but it's almost obvious that educational opportunities has become heavily dependent on digital connectivity during the last 8-9 months. The time is ripe to envision a more fluid learning landscape in different spaces, inside and outside the school, in flexible times and forms using a multiplicity of means and methods. The Futures of Education initiative I mentioned before, led by an international commission, is calling now for a broadening of the right to education to encompass a right to connectivity. And UNESCO is preparing the ground for a global declaration on connectivity for education in the coming months. To sum up about this topic, a resilient recovery calls in every context for an inclusive ethos to build back equal valorization of teachers and equitable connectivity and technology for learning for all. After this sketching a bit the landscape, let me expand a bit more on transformative dimension on learning itself for self, society, and sustainability as well. The pandemic's global span and anxiety and loss it has generated everywhere has only intensified the urgency to act in solidarity, to nurture empathy, emotional intelligence, and awareness of our interrelationship, increasingly dependent on interconnectedness. The key word I want to emphasize about this point is about a new kind of solidarity once again. It has shown that education can not only serve an economic model, it must serve an ethical and societal one. Because beyond solving a crisis, this is a time for deep reflection on the substance of learning, particularly as we struggle against the denial of scientific knowledge and actively fight misinformation in this crisis. UNESCO has always defended a humanistic vision of education, I'm sure you know, based on our constitutional principles, building peace in men and women minds. I spoke earlier about the culture of inclusion. It's about a culture of peace, of global citizenship, of prizing and protecting democratic values. It's about the role of education as not simply and crucially a source of knowledge and science, but it's about education as a vehicle for values. Significantly, the Sustainable Development Goal on education recognizes this. And it recognized before the pandemic, of course, since the beginning of the establishment of 2030 Agenda. Without getting technical issues, I can say that one of the target of SDG 4, target 4.7, aims to ensure that all learners in the world acquire the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles. And this is about better knowledge, more awareness, and action in order to protect the planet, in order to build a kind of new relationship between human beings based on cultural diversity, respect, dignity, and contributed to a real, socially speaking, cohesion within our society. This is really very much about keeping ahead a transformative vision of education. And this is about relaunching a key component of quality education today. It carries the promise of better future where young people understand the interconnectedness of people, cultures, economies, and nature. UNESCO leads work worldwide on education for global citizenship and sustainable development, for the prevention of violent extremism, working with youth, with teachers and governments to integrate, to embed these principles and practices into education systems. Recently, we participated in the launch of a global pact for education launched by another global leader, Pope Francis, to build a world based on fairness, solidarity through international cooperation and education, a kind of new global integrated approach where the person is at the very core of any kind of action we take. The transformation of education requires this kind of mindset, this kind of new knowledge, fresh evidence, and courage to question established beliefs and practices and to experiment, to go beyond the business as usual. The past 8 months have unlocked a culture of experimentation and innovation in education as in many other sectors. If societies are to become more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable, then higher education has to provide the intellectual infrastructure for its transition to happen, one that is economic, social, political, and environmental. Through the role of university in these current troubled times, I see really a message of hope and a concrete action plan for a university is becoming the right place to be in order to innovate, in order to develop research, in order to put research, knowledge, and teaching at the service of the entire community around them. Just this Tuesday in Geneva, our Director General, together with WHO, CERN, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, launched an appeal to enable universal access to scientific progress and its applications. As a scholar, as a linguist, in my previous life, but definitely still, this is my real job in life, I often go back to the origin of the word crisis, which is, as you know for sure, an ancient Greek word. Crisis in ancient Greek means from a verb which is krino, separate, judge, evaluate. So it's about the power of distinguishing and choosing. And choice entails deciding what we prize most, where we have to put priorities, where we have to put investment if you are a political leader. And this crisis has asserted that education matters for society. We need more than a global education movement today, but rather a societal movement where everyone and all of us has a stake in ensuring that education becomes universal, empowering, and inclusive. A new social contract that makes education a common good and a springboard, let me say, so to say, for a more equal and just world. I know Atlas and the future and UNESCO shares this common vision, this common utopia, which can become a real action plan in the coming months if we work together and we are committed as we are to make in utopia a real world. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefania and Professor Giannini. We have some questions. Let me start, though. I've had the privilege to make the couple first questions coming also from what you said. At the beginning, you were explaining how before the COVID, you launched the initiative, the Futures of Education. The idea was to rethink education, thinking in what the scenario is going to be in 2050, thinking in the context of global warming, increasing inequalities, the digital transformation and the growth and impact of artificial intelligence. But then the COVID arrived and Secretary General Guterres said the future of education is here. And we suddenly have both the urgency to reduce the inequalities that are being increased by the COVID impact, and also to build, as you said before, resilient, inclusive, and quality education systems for today and for tomorrow. How you also mentioned the initiative that you just started recently, the Global Education Coalition, that is trying to build alliance to answer this. The problem in many societies, like in ours, is that the short-term vision of education policies are quite limited to give answers to something that is much bigger. What is your perspective on how this paradox of having long-term homework and short-term policies could be solved?
Let me first alight the room because at this time there is sorry, I'm coming back.
Oh.
So now it's better. Yeah.
Much better.
Yeah, moving in the dark is not comfortable. At 6:30, they give a sign that it's time to go home in my office.
I mean, that's sustainability as well.
Yeah, that's sustainability as well. Well, I think that, as you said, politics is under pressure and is about the investing and prioritizing on topics, sometimes, not always, of course, which can give results in the short term perspective. Education is a kind of investment which can give results, the most important ones, in my opinion, in a more longer term perspective. What you can see now, that's why I mentioned the importance of this global education meeting and the reaction from political leaders from all regions of the world, is that this crisis emphasized the importance of education. When 1.6 billion students have been overnight almost out of school, and teachers declared that they were not prepared to move from the traditional classroom to the virtual ones, I think that all of us, from political leaders to common citizens, parents, caregivers, but everybody understood and realized that schools are not simply a place where we learn, but places where children can find nutrition, can find self-protection, can find social context, and great opportunity for growing up healthy and with an open mind. So I'm confident that because of this crisis, education can really be prioritized more than in the past, and political leaders can respect the commitment they took last week in this global room we organized and convening this meeting, was about really making them open to change a bit the model of political decisions about education.
We have different questions from different parts of Europe, and even one from Canada, and I'm trying to organize them. Eva Irsnova from Brussels was asking about the future of education, something that you just addressed now. Another question here is regarding this discontinuation of learning in school and everything related with online learning. Oliver Juggins asking for how educators can address what is being missed in learning online, or Ismail Fayed from Canada is asking whether UNESCO have some collaborative technology infrastructure that can be used by developing nations with local initiatives to develop this. A little bit all of this goes to the idea that if education is conceived as a common good, as Rethinking Education said, many of the elements that every one of the societies are addressing should be ideally used by all the others, because we are facing a problem that is global. So in this context of discontinuation of presential learning, is there any approach of this common good for education to use solutions to be shared and to contribute for all children to access to learning in these times of lockdowns?
Yes, I mentioned before the initiative we took as UNESCO with all partners of the UN system, but not only remaining within the traditional family of the international organization which are involved in education, and we immediately enlarged the call for action to other partners, civil society, private sector, and so on. This Global Education Coalition, which is still running over 70 countries nowadays, is giving concrete solutions. So The first question you put about is there any platform where it's possible to find contents, methodologies, and structures that developing countries can use? Yes. We are launching, for instance, tomorrow, a specific platform dedicated to the Francophone region of sub-Saharan countries. It will cover 10 countries, and it's about helping governments in that region to organize better digitization of curriculum and content for learning in French. So this is a simple example of how this new kind of partnership I mentioned before could provide, from the beginning of the crisis, some concrete tools to the education community in many regions of the world. Another example I would like to mention is about those regions of the world or countries of the world where you cannot rely on the e-learning necessarily, because connectivity, as I said, is not yet a real right for everybody. About that, we encouraged and technically assisted, and still are doing that, countries to implement and put in practice the so-called hybrid models. That means radio, TV channels, and organizing, of course, learning content in a different way, and being transmitted by these more traditional, I should say, tools that and devices that in some countries, Senegal, for instance, from the very beginning of the crisis, could guarantee continuity of learning. Continuity of learning somehow is the red line of all the initiatives we are running with our partners in education in this unprecedented situation.
Some of the questions that are being raised are related with this concept of educating for sustainable development and for global citizenship. Actually, the Incheon Declaration has a very specific definition of what quality education is, explaining the kind of competencies that kids should develop to address the local and global challenges. And in 2017, UNESCO published this very useful document, Education for the Sustainable Development Goals, where it says that we are talking about holistic and transformational education that addresses learning content, outcomes, pedagogy, and the learning environment. And actually refers to cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral learning objectives. The idea that is not that kids should know what an SDG is, but they have to have the competencies to be able to answer this. And just a week ago, the PISA 2018 was released with the concept of global competence, the first one, showing that how to learn, how teachers should be equipped, and how to measure these competencies is particularly relevant. And on these, many of the questions, Adeti Marco Polo, for instance, is asking about how to move from towards a transdisciplinarity approach in the traditional educational structures. And Mark Langdon from Glasgow in Scotland is talking about how the learning that happens outside schools that could be related with this competential approach could be recognized in formal education. Or Kathy from the UK is asking on which changes could be done in schools to play a more active role in tackling the climate and biodiversity emergencies. On all of this related with this global competency or with this education for the Sustainable Development Goals, how do you see that in the work that UNESCO is doing to push and to inspire governments to change? How do you think that this is properly achievable?
Well, you touch upon the different issues, but they are, they belong to the same kind of objective we have, which is about, let me say, putting the so-called soft skills at the very core of the learning and teaching process. What we called in the last century soft skills, I'm sure, will become the hardcore of learning and teaching in this century, just to put it a bit simply. That means when you see education as a real cross-cutting goal within the 2030 agenda, and when you see education as the real precondition to implement all the other goals, because education is about, as we said before, knowledge, awareness, and behaviors and action. Of course, you have to adapt the system of learning and teaching, and you have to transform education itself in order to be able education to transform society. This is very much about what I mentioned before, the so-called 4.7. That means education must be the device, the tool to inspire a new kind of relationship between the humankind and the planet, and the relationship between all of us as human beings. I mean, it's not an easy task, of course. It's not simply about curriculum development. It's not simply about teachers training. It's not simply about adapting the learning environment to this new kind of challenging objective. It's very much about making education the taking care system. If you ask me which is the most important word we have in this century, if you want to protect the planet, it's the only one we have. If you want to protect our respect, dignity as a human persons, and put the person at the very center of what we are doing, either we are political leaders or educators or businessmen, I think that the phrase I would use is taking care of others, taking care of nature, taking care of cultural diversity, and putting respect and dignity at the center of what we are doing. And to do that, I think that we have to go a bit beyond the traditional way we somehow shape and framed education systems in the world. This crisis can help us to do that. Let me put a very concrete example about that. And it goes back to the question coming from Glasgow, if I understand correctly. I mean, there are a lot of many ways of learning and teaching that usually we don't put in the formal curriculum development and the pathway, the journal, the educational journey to acquire achievements and to be recognized in terms of qualifications and degrees. But this unprecedented social experiment we are doing within this COVID-19 crisis made us aware that schools are not the only place where we can learn, because we could see around the world the parents, for instance, in this e-learning system becoming main actors of the learning process. We could see that schools are not the only time where we learn and we teach, because this crisis somehow broke up the fixed term of learning from 8 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock or whatever. So the global laboratory for innovation that this crisis somehow suddenly created and forced education systems to transform themselves can become a real opportunity to put soft skills, if we still want to call them like this, and social emotional learning at the very center of a new agenda for education in the coming years. And I think that this can really become a acceleration, a new accelerator for transforming education in order education can transform society.
I would like to focus for a second on something that is relevant and that you many times mentioned, maybe not today that relevantly, which is gender inequality and the role of education of that. Not only at global level, which is quite evident in many countries, we still have a big gap between boys and girls on access to education, but also on how education could be a tool to achieve proper gender equality in societies. We are seeing that in the context of COVID, this inequality in education is being again increased. And I would like to get some of your reflections on that issue, on the problem and on the potential solutions or actions to solve it.
Thanks for keeping back a point. You're right. I didn't mention so much today, as it's part of inclusion, the objective of inclusion that I stress very much in my presentation. Gender equality, of course, is one of the priority we have, because without giving all girls and young women and women in the world the right to be free, to choose their own life through education first, will not have a real sustainable and just society as we want to reach as a main objective of 2030 agenda. So SDG number 5 is another very important and cross-cutting one. We put the lens of gender equality on this crisis, and we immediately could see from the beginning of the crisis that the gender divide, which is still very much high in many regions of the world, is supposed to increase. It's supposed to increase not only and simply in terms of a potential dropout. I mentioned before a number, 24 million students today are at risk of dropout this year because of the COVID-19, and almost half of them are girls. But it's not about that. I mean, there is an equivalence about this point. It's very much more about some specific constraints and specific conditions that girls are suffering in some regions of the world still, like early marriage, early pregnancies, and worse than this, maybe, if I can say like this, violence at home. And all these issues are supposed to increase. How can we say that? We can say that looking at some lessons learned from other comparable situations, somehow, like Ebola crisis, which brought out the problem of early pregnancies and marriages in some countries of Sahel region, where Ebola crisis definitely hit very much. This is a global crisis, so gender equality must be addressed with different tools and different kind of objectives. I mentioned these topics related to the south of the world. I can mention digital divide that was already a topic in many regions like Europe and the north of the world, and is supposed to increase because of COVID-19. So we have a clear mind about what must be done. Of course, still is a question of putting the gender lens in education more than before.
Yeah, I wanted to raise this question because I know that you have been working so much on this, and that sometimes we always talk about this gender element as something that happened in the South. And in the last 2-3 years in Spain, we have had, and we still having, several cases of young men, even boys from 15 to 25, that are doing group sexual aggressions to young girls, which is something that is terrible, because it means that there is some kind of socialization that makes this as a normality. So this is a big problem, not only for the South, but also for the North. And there is a key element here in education. And we are in the last minutes, and I just wanted to raise the last questions that are being referred to universities. You have a long experience as that on that, both as a policymaker and as a scholar and a rector yourself. Aranzazu Ascunce says how universities could play a larger role in this global education crisis. And Cathy Lecumberri asks, what would be the strategic lines of universities to achieve innovation? I know that UNESCO is preparing the World Conference on Higher Education for 2021, and probably this role on higher education of universities to innovate on how to learn and to be key players on this global learning crisis could be or might be addressed. Maybe you could tell us something on that just to finish the session.
Yes, happy to conclude on higher education, which is quite close to my heart, and let me say is really the main infrastructure for development. I put it like this: there will not be development in the north as in the south of the world without a strong infrastructure of research and knowledge at the higher education level. Having said that, universities and higher education as a system reacted as an average very well to the crisis. No, I mean, moving from libraries and traditional classroom at university to online courses was easier for university than schools systems in the world. At the same time, there are many challenges still for universities in the coming months and years, as the financial crisis is very much hitting many countries in the world. I should say all regions of the world. As I said before, we asked political leaders to pledge and to commit to investing in education. And universities will be maybe one of the sectors absolutely more affected by that. The 24 million projection, it's a projection, of course, it's not a real number, of students at risk of dropout this year are very much polarized, and it's interesting, this issue, I think, in the two extreme segment of the educational journey, preschooling and university level. It's not by chance that the risk of leaving higher education behind is a really very concrete one. So I think we have to raise up awareness about the importance of investing not only in education as a public sector, but in higher education, which is not a luxury, but is very much part of education as a human right.
Well, I think that we are just covered this hour of conversation. Thank you very much for being such an inspiring leadership from UNESCO, which is a moral reference for many of us. And thank you for sharing your time with the many teachers from several places of Europe that had been listening and thinking about how the future of education could be. Many thanks.
Thank you, Eduard, to you and all participants, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eduard. Thank you, Stefania, for your time. It has been really a lovely debate, very inspiring. Thanks, everybody, also for connecting and for your questions. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but we will be here again next week on Thursday, and we will have the opportunity to get to know Eduard better, because Eduard Vallory will be our next keynote speaker. So see you all there, and let's keep fixing the future.